Get vaccinated now. It's free. It's convenient. I promise you, it saves lives. And I honest to God believe it's your patriotic duty.
US President Joe Biden urges Americans to get vaccinated and outlines new efforts to combat the Omicron variant. Plus, has the administration's Build Back Better agenda been dealt a fatal blow? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. Senator Joe Manchin's announcement that he is firmly opposed to President Biden's Build Back Better legislation has angered Democrats and the White House. We'll have more on that later in the program, but we begin with the Omicron variant, which now accounts for 73% of new infections in the United States. President Biden has outlined new efforts to combat the surge. For more, we turn now to CGTN's Nathan King. He's at the White House. So Nathan, this is all happening as folks were planning to gather for the holidays. What did the president have to say?
Well, obviously, this administration has really been caught unprepared for the spread and the rapid spread of the Omicron virus. Now, they may not have known about this a month ago, but definitely 2 or 3 weeks ago, evidence out of Southern Africa and Europe really had given them time to prepare. But let's face it, this is a president that doesn't want to cancel Christmas. And in his address, even though he's unveiled new measures, he is not banning gatherings. He's not urging Americans not to come together. Essentially, what he's doing is saying there's going to be 500 million free testing kits that you can order online from January, although we don't know the details yet, that the military is going to be able to support the hospitals if they do become overwhelmed. And essentially, he's separating Americans onto the naughty list and the nice list. The naughty list is the people that haven't got vaccines or boosters, and the people that spread information, including on the airwaves about COVID-19 and the problem with vaccines. Let's take a listen.
Look, the unvaccinated are responsible for their own choices. But those choices have been fueled by dangerous misinformation on cable TV and social media. You know, these companies and personalities are making money by peddling lies and allowing misinformation that can kill their own customers and their own supporters. It's wrong. It's immoral. I call on the purveyors of these lies and misinformation to stop it. Stop it now.
Well, obviously blaming the media is important because of the disinformation that we've had here in the American media system. But also, let's face it, this administration, which had very good marks on COVID after the debacle of the Trump administration, is struggling with Omicron. Whatever measures it put in place to deal with Delta, the death rate, as you know, has continued steady. 800,000 dead. With the Omicron virus, the fears are that over Christmas we're going to see more hospitalizations, more deaths, and that could approach 1 million by the new year. This is a very worrying moment for the Biden administration. But of course, politically divided here, you can't order people to do anything.
Nathan, let's turn now to the news over the weekend that Joe Manchin, the key vote in the Senate, was a no vote on the Build Back Better legislation. Now, much has been said about whether the White House was blindsided by this. That's just speculation. But what can you tell us, and what does it mean for the president's agenda?
Well, I mean, this has turned from the Build Back Better plan to the Build Back Perhaps Never plan. As you know, there was a three-legged stool for the Biden administration coming in. First was to pass a new round of COVID support. They got that. Then was the infrastructure bill. They got that, although it was hard won. But this is the big kahuna, as they say in the US, in terms of supporting the Democrat progressive agenda, not just when it comes to climate change, but all sorts of social safety net provisions that have been long-held Democratic wants, but actually may suit the times as we emerge from COVID. Well, the problem is the electoral math. They have a 50-50 majority with the vice president as a casting vote in the Senate, and 1 or 2 senators, including Joe Manchin, as you mentioned there, from West Virginia, just hasn't been sold on it. Now, we do understand that things may be progressing. They may get something out of this, but a plan that was $3 trillion cut to less than $2 trillion, well, Joe Manchin says he can't sell it to his voters. Let's take a listen.
I've always said this, Brett, if I can't go home and explain it to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it. And I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible. I can't get there.
You're done. This is a no.
This is a no.
A big no. Is he the Grinch? Is he Scrooge? Well, lots of Democrats think so. But let's face it, this is Democratic votes, not Republicans. Democrats, if they were united, would move forward on this legislation. They are not. So this is a huge political problem for Joe Biden, not just COVID, going into the Christmas break and into the new year. Everything, electorally at least, depends on it.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting there from the White House. Well, there is a lot to talk about, as you can imagine. Let's get to our panel. Aaron Maté is the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone's digital channel. Jadan Horyn is a writer and conservative commentator. Also with us is Melik Abdul. He's a Republican strategist, writer, and political analyst. And Joseph Williams is back with us. He's the former senior news editor at US News and World Report. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Joseph Williams, President Biden, as we just heard, addressed the country from the White House on Tuesday. He repeated his appeal for people to get vaccinated. But as Nathan told us, was this too late? Was the White House caught unprepared for this variant?
It's hard to argue that they weren't caught unprepared, mainly because we'd known about the Omicron variant for some weeks leading up into this, and mainly because Delta was in full force when we got news that Omicron was on the horizon. So the White House indeed had plenty of time to plan for this. Why no more plans weren't enacted is a mystery. They did indeed roll out a strategy a couple of weeks ago, including these pods and clusters that they were going to send out to hard-hit places. But to have a speech almost as Omicron washes over the shores, rather than having one preparing the nation for what was about to come, it's hard to explain why he hasn't made more use of the bully pulpit.
And was there anything new in today's speech?
Not a whole lot. The big headline has been these 500 million tests that are going to be sent out, but that's not going to happen until January, and people are looking for tests right now. In fact, that's one of the things that your reporter Nathan King mentioned, is that these testing kits should have been on the way and should have been headed to every household months ago, if not sooner. And to have them not roll out until January is a big problem. But the other news that came out of this is that the National Guard is going to support what is expected to be a pretty brutal wave of COVID coming on top of the sonic boom that we had coming out of the Thanksgiving holiday. So we're looking for a really difficult December, and there's going to be a lot of people with COVID-like symptoms. Even breakthrough infections are expected to rise. So it's not going to be a happy time unless people are vaccinated, and even then you still run the risk of getting ill.
Melik Abdul, welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. What did you make of the address on Tuesday from the White House and essentially Biden's response to the Omicron variant?
Honestly, I actually disagree a bit as far as the administration being caught flat-footed. I think the problem with COVID is what we've been seeing since the beginning of the pandemic. It's a very difficult thing to predict. It's a very difficult thing to actually mitigate, because a lot of what we're talking about is essentially personal responsibility. What do people do as far as social distancing, sanitizing their environment, wearing not just those surgical masks that really aren't useful outside of the operating room, but the N95 masks. I think Biden is actually realizing that it's actually very difficult to dictate human behavior. There was a lot of criticism of the Trump administration that they didn't do enough to actually encourage people to get masks. Sure, there were things that Donald Trump himself was personally responsible for when it came to the actual messaging, but when it came to what the federal government was doing to try to mitigate it, I think the federal government did probably about as best as it could. And even in the Joe Biden, in the situation that we have now, despite knowing earlier, much earlier, as far as the Omicron variant being the possibility of being in the United States, what exactly is the federal government's role beyond encouraging people to get vaccinated, encouraging people to get tested? I think that this is what we're seeing now is the limits of the federal government in a situation where human behavior actually dictates how far we go.
Melik, I think a lot of people would agree with you that you cannot dictate human behavior, but you know, to Joseph Williams' point that he does have the bully pulpit, and perhaps he could have used that a bit more effectively earlier.
Yeah, but the thing is, doing what though? Because that's one of the things, again, that Donald Trump was criticized for, that he didn't use the bully pulpit in a responsible way. So what has Joe Biden done? He's encouraged people to get vaccinated. He's encouraged people to get tested. He's providing resources to schools and all of these type of things, which is really what the government does. There's a lot of anxiety that people have about COVID, and it's actually warranted. But I don't think that I think the messaging probably is the biggest problem that the administration has as far as resources, because they have been bad with messaging. And frankly, I don't think this type of downing people or this the vaccinated versus unvaccinated, that it's a danger.
Right.
I actually don't think that type of language is helpful, because I've been vaccinated, but my friends, when they hear that type of thing, when I see people respond, they recoil at this notion that they're being treated a certain type of way, or there's a lot of criticism for this. And I actually think it's a very bad move for Joe Biden to go in that direction of essentially condemning people who don't get vaccinated. That's not the right move.
Aaron Mate, we of course remember the withering criticism under which the former president, Donald Trump, came under on how he handled this pandemic. But here's something that's really puzzling. We've just had data from, in fact, this data's been around for a little while, from Johns Hopkins, which show us that more people have died from COVID during the first year of the Biden presidency than people who have died during the last year of the Trump presidency. And given that we've had the vaccine during the Biden presidency, I mean, how does one explain this?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how you explain those numbers, but how you explain, I think, widespread distrust in the government is the shifting responses. Back when Trump was overseeing COVID, every death was put personally on him. Since Biden came in, the message has been very, very different. And that's part of the problem here. This serious pandemic, this global health issue, has been a casualty in the U.S. of uniquely dysfunctional partisan politics, when it shouldn't have been. I mean, as Biden said today, and I think this was a good thing for him to say, the vaccine was a bipartisan achievement. But the problem was, when Trump was president, you had people like Democrats, including Kamala Harris, saying that, questioning whether they would even get the vaccine and questioning whether Trump was moving too fast to produce a vaccine. Now that Biden's in charge, the message is very different. And I wish Biden, instead of demonizing people who are unvaccinated, I think it's good to encourage people to get vaccinated, but to demonize them, I think, is a bad idea. Instead of doing that, take some responsibility. Acknowledge the mixed messaging. Acknowledge the fact that Dr. Fauci, whatever his positive contributions, also has given mixed messages when it comes to masks, when it comes to how transmissible how COVID is, whether you're vaccinated or not. Take some responsibility for the government's failures, and I think that would do a lot to increase the vaccination rate.
Jadan Horyn, listening to President Biden talking this afternoon, he appeared to be trying to strike a balance here with the advent of the Omicron variant. Thousands more testing sites will be opened, and he's urging people to get vaccinated, and for those fully vaccinated to get the booster shot as well. But at the same time, as Nathan told us, he's ruled out any kind of lockdown or prevent people from gathering during this festive season. What did you make of that approach?
I think it's really telling. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, had to come out in advance of this and say that the president wasn't going to be ordering any shutdowns or lockdowns. I think the media is expecting that President Biden and Democrats would, kind of advocate for the policies that they criticized President Trump for. But now that they're in power and now that they have the choice, they also understand that often those tools are not effective. And we have seen in the United States, mixed results from our shutdown. So, I think Biden really was seeking to be kind of a comforter in chief and saying that he is as frustrated as every other American. And I actually find it pretty amusing that the media is piling on since, the president had his address today, saying that he's not doing enough. He hasn't gone far enough. He didn't announce anything new. And while those are valid critiques, I definitely think, and I agree with other panelists that say there's limited ability of what the president can actually do. Jared Polis in Colorado, in advance of Biden's announcement, said that he would not advocate or shut down or lock down Colorado. He's a Democratic progressive governor. So I think if your own allies in your own party are saying that there are certain things they're just not willing to do, and that we need more information on this variant before we take such draconian actions that could affect people's livelihoods, mental stability, parents, kids, etc., then that's what the president really heard and acted on. And so I think what we expect from Biden and this administration is an understanding that this virus is really ultimately out of human control except for mitigation. And that we need to stay vigilant, but we also need to stay positive and not operate out of fear.
Okay, let's move on to the other big political story, and that's Joe Manchin and the Build Back Better legislation. Joseph Williams, President Biden suffered a major political setback this past Sunday when Joe Manchin, I should mention, is one of his own party members who said that he would not support this piece of legislation. This is a signature law for Joe Biden. How big a blow is this to the president?
It's hard to overstate how big it is, mostly because there was such a long, drawn-out negotiation between President Biden and Joe Manchin, and they thought that they had, the two Joes thought that they had a really good working relationship because they're both creatures of the Senate. But when it turned out that not only did Joe Manchin put a lump of coal in President Biden's stocking, but he also did it on Fox News. Without a heads up, those are three instances that go against the grain with the kind of collegiality and respect that both parties had expressed towards one another. And also the fact that this was a huge, huge centerpiece of President Biden's. He had sold it or tried to sell it himself to the public on television. There were a lot of good things in it that would address some of the very things that helped get him elected, including child care issues, including doing something to address climate change and doing something to address, frankly, wealth and inequality. So it was a really big roundhouse kick to the solar plexus that Joe Manchin delivered, and it's going to be difficult for them to recover from that.
Melik Abdul, Joe Manchin has given us a few reasons on why he is opposed to this bill, why he can't support it. But if you look at the bill, there is much in it, in the Build Back Better bill, much in the plan that would benefit working class Americans, like the kind of people who live in West Virginia, which Joe Manchin represents. And in his speech today, Biden made the point when he said his bill would help working class families provide health care for their children. He talked about a scenario where a family may need medicine for a sick child, but would not be able to afford it. This law would fix that. Let's listen to what the president said.
Not only do you put the kid's life at stake, you strip away all the dignity of a parent looking at their child. I'm not joking about this. Imagine being a parent. Look at a child, and you can't afford. You have no house to borrow against. You have no savings. It's wrong.
So, Melik, doesn't the president have a sound argument there? And isn't Joe Manchin actually acting against the interests of the people he represents?
A politician acting against the wishes of the people they represent. Is there such a thing in the United States? Well, of course he is. There are plenty of instances of politicians acting in ways just like Joe Manchin. There's a lot of conversation about this, but at this point, Joe Manchin is what John McCain was to the Republican Party when they tried to actually end Obamacare when Trump got in office, and John McCain gave that infamous thumbs down. I think that there's a problem of the media overstating this, but also a matter of the Biden campaign and now administration both over-promising and under-delivering. Many of those things are things that Republicans supported. Now, keep in mind, there's an entire infrastructure package that Republicans actually voted for that was actually bipartisan.
Yeah.
What Democrats did, and I think this is where they erred early on, they started calling this human infrastructure. What we're now referring to as the Build Back Better plan was the human infrastructure plan. And what Democrats did, they tried to lump all of this together along with the infrastructure plan. And most people realize that in the first year of a president, you typically have one bite at the apple for actually passing major legislation. For Obama, it was actually the Affordable Care Act. For Donald Trump, it was actually the Tax and Jobs Act of 2017. Joe Biden was actually able to get the infrastructure package out in addition to the stimulus package out earlier in the year. This does not mean that we can't revisit some of these things that Republicans have actually supported, like child tax care and things around climate change. Republicans have actually supported that, but they erred in making this all part of an all or nothing package. So in order to get the infrastructure package, you had to have the human infrastructure package, and they were going to have some people who were not on board.
Matter, how big a mistake was that on the part of the Democrats, especially progressive Democrats, to allow these two pieces of legislation, the infrastructure legislation and Build Back Better, to be essentially decoupled? Because if it was done together, then they would have had leverage over Joe Manchin, wouldn't they?
Yes, and unfortunately, this is a point made only by 6 members of Congress, the squad, the progressive members of Congress. Back when the Progressive Caucus allowed for the decoupling of these packages, they warned something like this would exactly happen, and they were right. Manchin appears to have never been serious despite what he says. There are reports, like in the Washington Post, that he explicitly rejected the continuation of the expanded child tax credit, which is just simply cruel. We're talking about a measure that lifted 10 million children out of poverty, including tens of thousands of children in Manchin's home state. So for progressive Democrats to give up their only leverage, literally their only piece of leverage, I thought was a huge error. And I don't know if there's a way to salvage it. Manchin seems pretty set on his agenda. The Congress wants to move on. It doesn't seem like Manchin is going to budge despite whatever mixed messaging he puts out. And meanwhile, look at the symbolism. Just this month, as the last checks went out for people receiving the expanded child tax credit, Congress overwhelmingly passed this new bipartisan spending bill for the Pentagon, $768 billion, more than $20 billion more than the Pentagon even asked for, something like $8 trillion over 10 years. And meanwhile, Manchin speaks about, being concerned about the debt while he votes for mammoth bills like this and votes for wars that are financed largely by debt. It's a joke, and I do think that the Progressive Caucus made a very, very big mistake in giving up the only leverage that they had.
Jadan Horyn, of course, there was much anger among Democrats over this announcement by Joe Manchin over the weekend. Here's the leader of the Progressive Caucus among the Democrats, Pramila Jayapal. Let's listen to her.
I think that if we are to look at history and the fact that we thought we had an agreement that apparently he's now saying we didn't have, I don't see how we can negotiate with somebody who changes their position all the time and whose word you cannot rely on. And I think he is going to have to answer to the American people, to women across this country who have been pushed out of the economy because they don't have childcare, to people who desperately want pre-K so they can lower their costs. We're not giving up, but I have to be clear that we are also going to, at the same time that we work on legislation, call on the president to take executive action.
So, Jadan, the president actually still believes that he can continue negotiations with Joe Manchin. He said that in a parting shot as he left the news conference this afternoon. And Pramila Jayapal herself has said that, look, she has had a conversation with Joe Manchin and maybe something could happen there. But what about the rest of Congress? What about Republicans? Do you think any of them could be dislodged from this sort of solid opposition to it that they have right now?
No, of course not. And I think, to go back to a previous panelist's point, the decoupling of the two bills, the so-called human infrastructure and actual infrastructure, it was inevitable. There was no way that a bill like this with both parts would ever pass in this Senate. And we have to understand the cold reality of both politics and economics here. While we can talk about Pentagon spending, there is an essential aspect of defense. And there was 89 votes in the Senate for that piece of legislation. It is not just because it has been over 10 years, but there are actual real funding, there are real concerns. There's a pay raise for the military in that. There's funding for in defense Ukraine. There's an investigative panel for Afghanistan. So there are things in that legislation, and yeah, annualized over 10 years is a lot of money. But what is going on with the Build Back Better? Joe Manchin made a decision that ultimately inflation will hurt poor and working class, middle class West Virginians more than the benefits, or so-called benefits, that he ascertained in that bill.
Yeah,
and the real
Jadan,
opposition
there have been some studies done by the Tax Foundation, the Tax Policy Center, by Moody Analytics as well, which tells us, look, there will be inflation, but it's going to be modest. In fact, Joe Manchin is exaggerating this.
Well, I mean, the thing is that, measures of inflation often remove basic things like food and fuel costs, which are variable. And the problem is that's a really cute way the economics and, economists can essentially say that it, averaged over time, it doesn't impact you. But for poor people and working class people, those are their main sources of expenses. So when he hears from everyone in his state that they can no longer afford a Thanksgiving turkey, that they cannot afford fuel, which is what he heard, and that is what he heard, that he's saying that those reasons are far more than a promise of economists down the line, and that's who he's going to listen to.
But he also benefits personally from opposing this bill. I mean, we know about his family's involvement in the coal industry in West Virginia as well. Look, I just want to get to Aaron Mate on something that you said, Jadan. Aaron, Jadan Horyn said a moment ago that, when we look at that Pentagon bill that was passed, where there was almost, $750 billion, 789 billion, I think it was. He says, look, there are real concerns. This is real funding. It's not the same thing.
Yeah, and I heard one of those concerns from the speaker was that we need to help defend Ukraine. I think if you were to poll most Americans, what is a bigger priority for you? Funding a proxy war in Ukraine to further NATO expansion, or lift American children out of poverty? I'm pretty sure even across the spectrum, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, more Americans would favor taking care of child poverty at home rather than filling the coffers of military contractors. That is what this really is about. There's a new article in Politico by the organizers of the People's March, who have been putting pressure on Joe Manchin. And they point out that there's more in the Pentagon bill for Lockheed Martin, $75 billion for Lockheed Martin, than there is in Build Back Better for preschool and childcare, which is $40 billion per year. Nearly double goes to Lockheed Martin instead of childcare. I think if you were to ask most Americans which they prefer, I'm pretty sure even across the spectrum, they would choose kids over contractors.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. I would love to continue, but Tom has caught up with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.